Peter Kurten was born into a home of extreme poverty and neglect near Cologne, Germany on May 26, 1883. He was the eldest of 13 children to an alcoholic father with sadistic tendencies. His father brutalized the entire family in the one-room apartment that they all shared for the duration of Kurten's childhood. He would often beat Kurten's mother and force her to perform sexual acts even while the children were present. At the age of 16, Kurten ran away from home to escape the continuing violence and sexual torture. Shortly after he ran away, his father was arrested for an incestuous relationship with Kurten's 13-year-old sister and was jailed for only 3 years. This was a much lighter sentence than Peter himself would later receive. The daily subjection to sexual violence must have had an immense influence on Kurten, and at the age of 9, he formed an unhealthy relationship with a dog catcher living in the same building as Kurten's family. This man eventually introduced Kurten to the practice of bestiality with the dogs that he captured. As Kurten matured sexually, his bestiality extended to sheep, goats, and other farmyard animals. The teenager also discovered he gained further pleasure when the animals were stabbed during intercourse. Kurten later admitted to mutilating the animals in order to achieve orgasm. His bestiality eventually stopped shortly after being caught by a farmer while trying to have intercourse with a pig and stabbing it to death. However, this was not the end of his crimes. As a teenager, Kurten committed several petty crimes in his hometown. These exploits soon led to the first of many short prison sentences, and he was repeatedly jailed for various misdemeanors, which predominated his existence over the next several years. With each successive sentence, Kurten's rage against society and his capacity for depravity increased. He also discovered a desire for sadistic sexual acts while in solitary confinement. Solitary gave Kurten plenty of quiet time to dwell on his fantasies, and he began breaking prison rules just to ensure the maximum amount of time in that lonely confinement. The appalling conditions within the prisons fueled his sadistic fantasies, which he now transferred from farm animals to humans. Kurten claimed to have drowned 2 school friends at the age of 9. Having pushed one over the side of a boat, the second dove in to rescue their friend, and Kurten then held both underwater until they had suffocated. At the time, the event was dismissed as a tragic childhood accident. However, during his periods of release from prison sentences, Kurten was responsible for multiple sexual assaults. These could not be so easily explained away, and as his sadistic tendencies increased, so did the severity of his crimes. Kurten's first confirmed murder victim was a 10-year-old girl named Christine Klein. Kurten raped and stabbed the young girl in her home in Cologne on May 25, 1913. The whole time, her parents were working in their pub below the apartment. Kurten returned to the scene of the crime the next day and was enamored by the horror the killing had invoked in the locals. He was especially excited when he saw the reactions after the sexual assault came to light. Christine's uncle had an argument with her father shortly before the young girl was killed, and he immediately became the main suspect. Fortunately, the innocent uncle was eventually cleared of the murder due to lack of evidence. All the while, Kurten followed the trial with interest, and it fueled his sadistic appetite to make others suffer. It wasn't until much later that he would admit to raping and killing the young girl in his confessions. In 1904, Kurten was drafted into military service following the start of World War I. Unfortunately, he did not enjoy living under military discipline, and he soon deserted from his barracks. He was immediately jailed once he was captured and remained in prison until 1921. This was Kurten's longest sentence to date, and his rage at what he viewed as an injustice intensified. After Kurten was released from the military prison, he moved to Altenburg. There he met and married a former prostitute named Auguste Scharf, who had been jailed at one time for the murder of her fiancé. He spent the next 4 years living a life of relative normality and found work as a molder, even becoming active in the trade union. Unfortunately, this normal life would be short-lived. The marriage was hardly a happy one, and Kurten was increasingly unfaithful to his wife. When Auguste realized that her husband had been sleeping with not one, but 2 of their maids, she forced one of them to press charges against Kurten for sexual assault. The charges stuck in court, and he was sentenced to yet another prison sentence for 6 months. After his release, Kurten found himself drawn to Dusseldorf. There, his criminal tendencies continued to escalate from more petty crimes and arson attacks to violent sexual attacks. One unlucky victim, Maria Kuhn, survived repeated stabbings by Kurten that caused 24 individual wounds. Kurten's preferred method of torture and murder was stabbing his victims with a pair of sharpened scissors. In addition to physically mutilating the victim, Kurten would sexually abuse and strangle them into unconsciousness. He occasionally returned to the crime scenes to discuss his crimes with police under the guise of a concerned citizen. Kurten's crime escalation began to reach its peak with the killing of 9-year-old Rosa Ullinger on February 9, 1929. She was stabbed 13 times by Kurten, who sexually climaxed during the brutal attack. He then dumped her body under a bush and had set fire to her in order to destroy the evidence. Rosa was the first of many victims that included young girls, women, and even some men. Over the next several months, Kurten murdered 6 people. The first was a woman that he stalked for almost a week. His plan was to crucify the woman on a decomposting tree in order to cause a scene for the public. Eventually, he settled for burying her and sent a detailed letter of the crime to police. He even included a map to her body. After writing the letter, Kurten switched from his signature pair of scissors to a knife in an attempt to throw police off his trail. He randomly stabbed 3 people, an 18-year-old girl, a 30-year-old man, and a 37-year-old woman. All 3 victims managed to escape, but each one described their attacker differently, which only confused the police. A 45-year-old mechanic named Scheer soon followed and was the victim of multiple stab wounds. Kurten again returned to the scene of the crime to relive the moment, even speaking to detectives about the murder. The German press covered the attacks extensively and thrived off the sensationalism Kurten was creating. When the newspapers discovered that authorities believed this violent killer might be drinking the blood of his victims, Kurten was named the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Unfortunately, during this time, the press and the authorities were misled when a learning disabled individual named Stossberg inexplicably admitted to all of the sadistic vampire killings. Stossberg had been accused of similar crimes in the past and was committed to an asylum after a quick trial. The police and the press were convinced that the case was closed. By August of 1929, it became obvious that the court's conviction of Stossberg was premature. A series of strangulations and stabbings occurred, which culminated in the brutal fairground murder of 2 girls, 5-year-old Gertrude and her 14-year-old foster sister Louise. The next day, Kurten assaulted another woman, Gertrude Schulte, who survived the attack, and gave police a description of her attacker as a pleasant-looking male around 40 years old. Attacks became more frequent and were widely publicized by the newspapers, throwing the population of Dusseldorf into a frenzied panic as the victim count soared higher. A woman named Ida Reuter was raped and killed in September, while a servant girl named Elizabeth Dorrier was battered to death in October. 2 other victims, named Muir and Wanders, were fortunate to survive brutal hammer attacks. Unfortunately, neither were able to give a clear description of Kurten, which made it difficult to narrow down the list of potential suspects. Kurten immensely enjoyed the panic and horror he created and fed off the attention he received from the press. He even went so far as to contact a newspaper in November of 1929. He sent a map to the location of Gertrude Alberman, a 5-year-old girl he had stabbed to death 2 days before, and dumped her body under a pile of trash. Kurten's attacks continued through that winter and into the spring of 1930, but none were fatal. They only served to escalate the horror. The harrowing stories of survivor attacks provided sensational copy for newspapers, and it also served as a distraction for the growing economic hardships being inflicted by the Great Depression. However, as enthralled as they were by the stories in the papers, public condemnation of the authorities for failing to catch the killer was becoming ever more widespread. May 14, 1930 saw the beginning of events that would result in Kurten's eventual capture. He offered a young unemployed woman, Maria Budlick, a place to stay and took her to his apartments. Kurten was hoping to have sex with her, but she refused. At first, he agreed to find her somewhere else to stay after her rebuttal and even took her to the train station. Suddenly, Kurten's attitude and Maria's situation changed for the worse as he forced her into a nearby forest and raped her before letting her go. No one was sure why he allowed her to escape with her life, but Kurten could now be identified. Throughout his reign of terror, Kurten still remained fond of his estranged wife. He cared enough for her that when he realized he could be identified by his latest victim, he devised a master plan to ensure Auguste's financial security following his arrest. Kurten confessed to his wife that he was the Dusseldorf vampire and detailed all of the sadistic attacks. Then he insisted that Auguste would be paid a large reward for turning him over to the authorities. On May 24, 1930, Auguste reluctantly did as her husband instructed and took the police to a designated meeting site at a local church. There, Kurten surrendered quietly. Once under arrest, Kurten provided horribly detailed accounts of his string of crimes to psychologist Professor Carl Berg, who later published the confessions in a book entitled The Sadist. Kurten claimed 79 individual violent crimes in all and went into great detail in order to convince the authorities of his guilt. Perhaps he did this hoping that his full cooperation would ensure the maximum financial benefit for his wife. Kurten's memory was nearly photographic, and his confession of each violent offense obviously provided him with great pleasure. The attending stenographers were much less enamored by his recollections. Kurten's trial began on April 13, 1931. Despite the vast number of crimes he was reported to have committed over the years, he was only charged with 9 murders and 7 attempted murders. He arrived in court looking much like a successful businessman, wearing a well-fitting suit. During the initial hearings, Kurten retracted his initial confessions and claimed that he had only sought to ensure his wife's financial security upon his arrest. However, intensive questioning by the magistrate and a damning pile of evidence caused him to eventually admit guilt after 2 months of interrogation. With no emotion in his voice, Kurten claimed that his violent childhood upbringing and the German prison system were responsible for releasing a sadistic monster on the world. He showed no remorse for his crimes and still appeared to relish his memories. The jury was only out for 90 minutes and returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. Kurten received 9 death sentences and was executed by guillotine on July 2, 1931 in Cologne, Germany. After he was executed, his head was mummified and bisected so that psychologists and medical scientists could examine his brain. They were convinced that a man so sadistic and violent could not have a normal brain, and it required extensive study. The mummified remains of Kurten's head are now said to be on display at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in the Wisconsin Dells. It hangs on a large rusty 4-pronged hook and looks every bit like a sadistic torture scene that Kurten himself would have appreciated.